The first topic of the day, Tom, we've got to return to GB News. Not because we want to. I still haven't watched anything from GB News live. I don't even know where the channel is. I have to admit that. But I've seen lots of clips that have been posted on social media. And it's just, for me, like you've said this a number of occasions, it's just a UK Fox machine, really, isn't it? It's propaganding. It's inviting guests on as well. That was rather frustrating, given their initial narrative. It's just inviting guests on that effectively agree with the presenters. They haven't invited anybody on, I don't think, that they didn't expect to challenge them. It's just a nice little safe chat to appeal to a certain demographic who possibly don't necessarily like to think too deeply, and just to propagandize information outwards that those people then don't question, they don't investigate or search for themselves, and they just basically bounces off them, in terms of conversations in the pub or at work, within their family, within the social conditioning of their children. And ultimately it's undemocratic and it's highly dangerous, but that's the way they've decided to go, and that's the way, and this is the focus for today, that's the way I think that their major investors want them to go. Because what we've seen, Tom, in the last few days is, or the last week or so, is an attack which it now appears to be orchestrated upon the NHS, and I suspect wider public services. So what we have, sorry, wrong page, what we have is a capacity by GB News to basically become a mouthpiece for financial organizations. And that in itself is, I think, a major problem. We got this tweet that was put out by Russ Jackson. GB News is funded by the disaster capitalist billionaire funded free market think tank, the Legatum Institute. Today, GB News is mostly demonizing and scapegoating our NHS. And obviously, he, in a sarcastic tone, he goes, "I'm sure it's all just a coincidence. If you still can't see the links, you're an idiot." So it's got here a GB News tweet. Now, this is coming out from GB News itself on Twitter. "If you're poor, you're more likely to die. Wasn't the NHS created to stop that from happening?" Now, if you're poor, you're more likely to die. So it looks like they're speaking to people who are on low income, who don't have much capital. So they've already identified their demographic, I suspect, as being lower to middle working class, which might explain why the right wing has spent probably the last decade trying to pull the rug from underneath the Labour Party's feet, which obviously was set up in 1900 to represent the lower, middle, upper working classes predominantly. And they've sought now to try and attract those same people to them, not with policies, not with strategies to make their lives better, but with fake news, falsehoods, lies, and propaganda. We won't go into the reasons why so many of those people, which are ironically called the Red Wall, why so many of those people are willing to believe this rubbish. But what we will focus on is who is behind it. And what we find is a Dubai-based investment group and pro-Brexit investor among 60 million pound funders to back GB News as it recruits 120 journalists. So who is Legatum? Well, the Legatum Institute is a neoliberal, sell everything off to billionaires who then skew the global population with stalagmite made of salt right through the abdomen and end up their ear until we cough blood and then choke. In other words, now their CEO, that basically is just a strong paragraph aimed at criticising and hopefully using a little bit of humour and irony. But their CEO is Baroness Philippa Stroud. Now, that sounds very establishment to me. Now, I thought GB News was supposed to be challenging the establishment, but it looks seriously like they're actually being funded heavily by the establishment. She is a member of the Conservative Party. Oh, okay, very establishment. And in 2009, the Daily Telegraph, very establishment, named her as the 82nd most influential right-winger ahead of former Conservative leader Michael Howard. Michael Howard, obviously renowned on Newsnight for his incapacity to answer questions. And then there's an article by Open Democracy, which goes into discussing how the Legatum Institute actually breached charity regulations, which isn't, something that GB News have given the population a lot of access to when they talk about who funds them. So what we have behind the scenes, and something that I think that a lot of people should be really, really fearful of if they're defending GB News, is a right-wing think tank, very pro-establishment in terms of those people at the top end, very clear agenda in terms of what they're seeking to do, getting rid or trying to undermine the National Health Service. The National Health Service, of course, which in terms of being depended upon, is very much depended upon by the lower, middle and upper working classes, probably more so than any other demographic group, because once you get into the middle classes, you tend to maybe to be more affluent, and then therefore you tend to have the opportunities and the choices to go private. You don't get that in the working classes. So the very organization that keeps people alive is now being ridiculed with little or no evidence to support it by a neoliberal right-wing group whose obvious agenda from their perspective is to get people to turn against the NHS, allow the NHS to be privatised, so that the ownership and the running of the NHS goes into the hands of extremely wealthy people who do not give a bleep about those people who watch GB News.
Yeah, that was fascinating, Jace. Thanks for sharing that, and urge people to have a look at the article and maybe even explore a bit about who the I pronounce it Legatum, but Legatum Institute are. They're certainly becoming more and more influential, both sides of the Atlantic, and heavily involved in Brexit, of course. So very interesting to explore who the Legatum Institute are and their links to the Conservatives and their links to right-wing politics in this country. Fascinating to see that they're involved in GB News, and to see GB News perniciously attacking the NHS in the way that they are is despicable, and we know their very clear ulterior motives to pave the way, and certainly in terms of public opinion through GB News, to pave the way for the destruction, the slow and steady destruction of the NHS to favour private health insurance companies, mostly from America, to swoop in and take over our healthcare, our entire healthcare system. And we're seeing that as we've as we've discussed with Dr. John Orrell, we've seen massive underfunding the last 11 years of government. We've seen massive underfunding of the NHS. We've seen cuts. We've seen privatisation and the opening up of our healthcare services to mostly American private healthcare companies, and turning us into an American-style model, which is disastrous. 2.5 times more expensive than any other developed country's healthcare system per person. 2.5 times more expensive, and utterly disastrous, deadly, and leaving huge amounts of people without medical cover and support. A barbaric system. And we're rapidly moving down that road. It's appalling. It's one of the most shocking, disgusting things. It's staggering that the entire country isn't up in arms about it. But they're not, because the mainstream media don't report it, or report it in the wrong way. And there's even now things like GB News that completely lie about it and are involved in that destruction of our NHS. Once it's gone, and people will regret it. It's another thing that
the massive issue here. If I can just interrupt.
Yeah.
Sorry, if I just interrupt here. The other issue, of course, is that they're very pro NHS when they actually speak. They don't. Well, that's why I say they're very pro NHS. They don't criticise the NHS in an obvious, explicit way. It's all done so subtly.
Yeah.
And that's the psychological warfare. Talk to any psychologist, they'll say the best way to adapt and change people's minds, beliefs, etc., isn't to whack them in the face. It's a drip, 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 drip. So they move to a new position without even knowing that they've moved.
Yeah, absolutely. As I've mentioned before on this show many weeks ago, the day after, the morning after the election in 2019, the hundreds and hundreds of Tory bots, so their fake Twitter accounts, or even their real supporters that they recruit to do this, that send out the almost identical tweet, hundreds and hundreds of them up and down the country send out an almost identical tweet. And it happened on the morning after the general election in December 2019. And the tweet was basically saying that the big problem with the NHS is people not turning up for appointments, that it costs vast amounts of money, and that's the big problem. Staggering that literally on the morning after the election, they activated their bots, hundreds of them, to send out an identical tweet. And it wasn't just that people were sending out were sharing the same tweet. People were sending it out as if it was theirs. I've got a friend who's a nurse who said, and they were all sending that tweet out like it was really them, and not coordinated from Tory central office, and just despicable. And of course, there's an issue with people not turning up for appointments, GP appointments or hospital appointments, whatever. Of course, there's an issue about that. That's not the issue with why our NHS is being destroyed, underfunded, privatised, and taken away from us by a vicious Tory government that wants to turn us into the United States of America. Massive profits for the 1% of the population, the rest of us dying without healthcare, with appalling terms and conditions of work. More and more people on a gig economy, more and more people lacking decent housing, decent education, public services. We are becoming like the United States of America, the most unbelievably unequal society. And right-wing people in this country and from America are involved in pushing for that. And going back to your point about right-wing think tanks like the Legatum Institute that have funded GB News, worth noting, there's a whole host of them. I mean, we're forever, if you're involved with independent media, as opposed to just consuming mainstream media, which never mentions it. But if you're interested in independent media and the truth and fact, you and I know that there are a whole host of right-wing think tanks. I quite often think to myself, where's the left-wing think tanks? There's hardly any. Certainly none that are influential like the right-wing ones are, but the right-wing ones, and most of them come from America, emanate from America, or are funded by incredibly wealthy, billionaires from America. But we just jotted down a quick list off the top of our heads. There's the New Economic Forum, the Heritage Foundation, the Adam Smith Institute, Legatum Institute, the Institute for Economic Affairs, which in the UK, which of course sounds very official, and like you should believe everything they say economically. The Institute for Economic Affairs, extremely right-wing economic think tank, and of course the Taxpayers Alliance, which is very active in this country, but even more so in America, is a global movement, and of course, run by many of the same people that were involved in Brexit once again, and their agenda is small, low tax for the wealthy. Surprise, surprise. So I mean, that's just off the top of my head. There's half a dozen there, and there are so many others to do with different spheres of public life. Whether it's the military or promoting climate change denial or whatever. So there's so many right-wing think tanks. Where's the left-wing think tanks? Maybe there's no rich billionaires that stand to profit from promoting policies that are good for the majority, sadly.
No, absolutely right. And you don't get people you don't lock people in a cage and turn the key and then walk away. Your best thing to do is to get people so that they don't want to leave the cage. So you just bombard them with fake news and nonsense and propaganda over and over again, so that when somebody comes along, maybe says to them, "Oh, I can open up that door for you, I can release you." For most of them, they don't want to be released because they fear what's outside of the cage a lot more than they fear what's inside the cage. So I think we should finish off with this, just asking a question, maybe asking a question directly to those people who watch GB News. Are you comfortable, folks, with watching a program that's effectively a chorus, constant echoes of noise that have very little to do with fact, with information, with enlightenment? An echo chamber for narcissistic, neoliberal, extremely rich people who effectively are treating you as nothing other than cud. You're only worth anything to them if you swallow the gump that they give you. You become a major threat to these people if you stand back and you say, "Oh, hang on a minute, that doesn't ring true." So let's just throw this question out to people who watch GB News. Come on, start thinking for yourself. Don't just become a flannel that's rinsed underwater and squeezed day in, day out.